let's talk about the messiah of small bean cinema, otherwise known as Wes Anderson. By now, most of you have likely been seduced at one time or another by this man's meticulously crafted mise-en-scène, intensely symmetrical composition, or quirky, somewhat disaffected twee characters. He piqued our interest with Rushmore, dazzled us with Fantastic Mr. Fox, and stole our little hearts with Moonrise Kingdom. And sometimes, Wes likes to explore beyond the limits of his polished East Coast veneer and into more exotic, more foreign, more mysterious territory. After sitting down for Isle of Dogs in 2018 for what I thought would be an unparalleled viewing experience, I ended up leaving the theater feeling that something was off. My friend and I racked our brains as we tried to figure out just what was up with the movie. The animation was astounding, the plot was fun and original, and the voice acting was superb.
What happened? Why did I do that? To this day, I have no idea. I guess he scared me. I bite.
And then we realized, Isle of Dogs is set in Japan, yet none of the Japanese characters speak. Sure, they say things, but due to a curious omission of subtitles, we, as a Western audience, don't know what they were saying. Here was a film where, by design, I could empathize more with the English-speaking characters and the dogs than I could with the Japanese characters, in a film about Japan. And the more I mulled this over, I realized this wasn't the only time I left a Wes Anderson film with this peculiar feeling. When I finished the Darjeeling Limited in high school, I couldn't help but feel a strange disconnection between myself as a viewer and the Indian characters. Really, if you look a bit more closely at these two films, you'll notice that Wes Anderson has a penchant for using the East, its culture and its people, as decorative background fodder, as a mystical landscape on which his white characters alone can navigate. This bizarre relationship of the Western viewer and the racialized Eastern subjects is a little thing we in academia like to call Orientalism. Coined in 1978 by renowned Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said, Orientalism refers to the essentializing way in which the West depicts and discusses the East, formerly known as the Orient. What we've seen in history, beginning with 18th century British and French imperialism, is a phenomenon in which Western art, literature, and scholarship tends to portray Eastern civilizations as developmentally static and culturally backwards. Eastern men tend to be emasculated in these narratives, while Eastern women are overly sexualized, representing everything that repressed Western women were not. These representations all tie back to the colonial imagination, the notion of Western domination over foreign territory. It's a problem of deliberate mischaracterization, and it brings with it the dogma that the Orient is at bottom something either to be feared, the Yellow Peril, the Mongol hordes, the Brown Dominions, or to be controlled by pacification, research and development, outright occupation whenever possible. It exists only in opposition and juxtaposition to the rational and superior West. In Said's words, in a sense, the limitations of Orientalism are, as I said earlier, the limitations that follow upon disregarding, essentializing, denuding the humanity of another culture, people, or geographical region. And while outright colonialism may have ended over half a century ago, its legacy persists today, and as such, so too does Orientalism. Politically speaking, Adam Schatz of the New York Times Book Review finds that Orientalism rears its ugly head whenever the US goes to war. We saw it with Vietnam when America's best and brightest had led the country into an untractable quagmire in the jungles of Southeast Asia. We saw it after 9/11 when the Bush administration reacted with a kind of Orientalist frenzy, heralding the liberation of Muslim women among its reasons for the invasion of Afghanistan. And if we go back further in time, we can see this attempt at mystifying the other in America's fraught history with Japan.
By all means, come to my Japan, if you dare. and welcome. It is beautiful here, as beautiful as the sight of your blood on our bayonets.
So I know what you might be thinking. Sure, Isle of Dogs is set in an eastern country, but that doesn't mean it's trying to sell some sort of narrative about cultural superiority or fear. You're right, Wes Anderson is not explicitly some sort of neo-colonialist who views the East as inferior, but that doesn't absolve his films of having Orientalist implications. When it comes down to it, Isle of Dogs is a Western movie with an Eastern backdrop. The majority of its cast is American and English-speaking. The majority of accolades for the film went to Americans, and the film's protagonists, the dogs, speak in English.
You heard the rumor, right, about her and Felix?
What'd you say
Felix?
about
No.
that?
What happened to him?
They mated.
If you haven't seen it, Isle of Dogs is Anderson's second foray into stop-motion animation. It's set in a dystopian near-future Japan, and it tells the story of a ragtag group of dogs and a little boy named Atari in their search for Atari's pet dog after all the dogs in the city have been banished to Trash Island by the authoritarian mayor and Atari's uncle, Kobayashi. Staying true to form with his meticulous attention to detail and hyper-realistic aesthetics, Anderson makes the bizarre decision to omit subtitles for the Japanese characters. As a result, every time a Japanese character speaks, such as Atari, Mayor Kobayashi, or assistant scientist Yoko Ono, played by Yoko Ono, their speech is either drowned out diegetically by an English translator,
The path favored by Mayor Kobayashi is cruel and unscientific.
reduced to oversimplified statements,
僕の犬だ Sit!
Well, I understood that. Sit down.
or simply left untranslated.
根絶持続可能
Leaving English audiences to guess what the speaker is saying based on facial expressions alone. This, along with the choice to translate the dog's barks into English, makes for a confused viewing experience in which the dogs and the white English-speaking characters are more dynamic, fully realized, and human than the Japanese characters. Now, this problem could have easily been avoided in two ways. One, Anderson could have created a comprehension barrier between the dog characters and all of the humans, in the likeness of a Charlie Brown special where the adult voices are incomprehensible to the viewer. Or better yet, he could have used only Japanese voice actors for all of the characters and then included subtitles. On top of the dissonance between the viewer and the Japanese characters, we are treated to a mishmash of vague references to Japanese culture. Kabuki theater, cherry blossoms, sumo wrestling, sushi, kimonos, haiku poetry, Japanese imperial imagery, and mushroom clouds. In Anderson's attempt to, well, Wes Andersonize Japan, the country becomes a monolith. We, as the audience, view Japan through the eyes of Anderson, a Westerner. And this is where the Orientalist implications come in. As Said states, the Orient is watched, since its almost but never quite offensive behavior issues out a reservoir of infinite peculiarity. The European, whose sensibility tours the Orient, is a watcher, never involved, always detached, always ready for new examples of what the Description de l'Egypte calls bizarre jouissance. The Orient becomes a living tableau of queerness. In Isle of Dogs, Anderson takes us on a tour through Japanese culture, never bringing us close enough to the humanity and complexity of its people, and thus imbuing in us his own limited understanding of the very country he sought to portray. Isle of Dogs is Japan through the lens of liberal Americanism, just as Orientalism is the East through the lens of the West. What's more, the sinister aspects of Orientalism in Wes Anderson's films are buried by the distractingly precious mise-en-scène. I think, and this is just speculation, that the heart of this problem lies in the fact that Wes Anderson simply struggles with writing for people of color. This is reflected in his comfort with writing films set in the US, which feature remarkably few racialized characters. Yet, when Anderson decides to step beyond his usual boundaries and into countries with majority people of color, these people become extras in their own land. Just look at the Darjeeling Limited. This 2007 film centers on 3 Americans who travel through India on a journey towards self-actualization and reconnecting with their estranged mother. While Darjeeling Limited carries with it an appropriate atmosphere of self-awareness, as we watch the brothers navigate their surroundings with an embarrassing sense of entitlement, some of this message becomes lost in the way Anderson frames India. As a Hindu myself, I can confidently say that, to the West, the spirituality of India has always overshadowed the actual people living there. The trope of a Westerner traveling to India on a path to self-discovery has always come at varying degrees of self-awareness, yet it never fails to reduce Indian people to curious backdrops or wise plot devices. We can be thankful that Anderson didn't include the stereotypical sage character in Darjeeling, but this doesn't let him off the hook when it comes to reducing Indians to decorative accessories. Essentially, the only two Indians with a character are Rita, a train attendant who has a brief tryst with Jason Schwartzman despite being in a relationship with Indian character number 2, the chief steward. Schwartzman's character, coming out of a painful breakup, pursues Rita after exchanging a total of 7 words with her.
Sweet lime?
Yes, please. Sounds good.
Beyond this, we know nothing of Rita, her wants and desires, or her history. All we know is that she's willing to forego her relationship for a total stranger. Think of Rita as a stand-in for the exotic, sexualized woman that Saeed speaks of. And then we have the chief steward, whose rightful distaste of the obnoxious brothers, which escalates to him kicking them off the train, is framed as a sort of nuisance. Think of him as a stand-in for Saeed's impotent, passive man. Of course, we can't ignore that these interactions are representative of the brothers' selfishness and entitlement, but once the brothers are off the train and Rita and the steward are no longer part of the plot, Anderson's self-awareness starts to wash away and his blind spots begin to reveal themselves. For the rest of the film, Indian characters become silent observers as their words become incomprehensible. In one particularly odious moment, the brothers attempt to save 3 Indian boys from drowning in a canal. Unable to save one of the boys, the brothers are invited back to the child's rural village for the funeral. This moment, set in slow motion to a Kinks song, is the ultimate catalyst for the brothers' self-actualization. Rather than coping with the objective trauma of watching a small child die an untimely death, this horrific moment is framed as a necessary obstacle on their spiritual journey. Although it may be integral to the plot, the death of a small Indian boy being treated so dismissively sends a message that brown bodies are expendable. As Joa Weiner of Slate articulates, in a grisly bit of developing world outsourcing, the child does the bothersome work of dying so that the American heroes won't have to die spiritually. There is no wink from Anderson here. This echoes what Lilie Chouliaraki calls the spectatorship of suffering, which describes the cognitive dissonance of Western viewers towards the abject suffering of people in distant lands, and the unequal power dynamic this creates between the spectator and the subject. Chouliaraki's theory builds heavily upon Saeed's work, as she states that Saeed would call this viewing asymmetry a contemporary mutation of the old divide between the West and the Orient. Again, in allowing the white Western characters to be fully fleshed out, while allowing the Indian characters to be passive objects, Anderson shows us what his version of India would look like. He presents India as an aesthetic and monolithic territory in which his white characters move about voyeuristically. Of course, Wes Anderson is not the sole perpetrator of Orientalism in Hollywood, and he's far from the worst. For decades, Hollywood has presented Eastern civilizations as unruly, mysterious, and strange. Everything from Lawrence of Arabia to Indiana Jones. To Lord of the Rings, to Kill Bill, and Sex and the City 2. Is guilty of stereotyping Eastern cultures and dehumanizing Eastern people. But the reason I focus on Wes Anderson is because his quote-unquote well-intentioned liberalism exchanges the narrative of fear and domination for a placid appreciation of other cultures, which allows his films to fly beneath the Orientalist radar. The seeming subtlety with which Anderson casts aside and stereotypes Eastern characters can result in the normalization of these tropes. So what can we do about this? Well, for one, demanding better writing from even the most beloved of directors is a good start. The East, a concept that is already monolithic in itself, is an incredibly diverse, complex, and multifaceted part of the world. Its people deserve agency in their own stories, and Hollywood directors need to approach these cultures with the nuance and sensitivity they deserve. No more silencing of foreign voices. No more using distant cultures as colorful and stereotypical backdrops. And no more relegating Eastern people to blank canvases on which the white characters can paint. This is why, when I watched Isle of Dogs back in 2018, I left the theater feeling hollow and frustrated. It's been almost 4 decades since Said exposed the shadow of colonialism that Western culture casts over the East, and Wes Anderson proved that we've learned nothing.